North Carolina Governor James Hunt said last night that he cannot and will not pardon the Wilmington 10, but he did reduce their sentences, making all but their leader, the Reverend Ben Chavez, eligible for parole this year. The 10 are 9 black men and 1 white woman convicted in 1972 of arson and conspiracy to shoot a policeman in connection with the firebombing of a white-owned grocery store. The incident took place during a week of racial violence in Wilmington that left 2 people dead. The 9 black men were given lengthy prison terms. The white woman is out on parole. Governor Hunt reacted to mounting pressure from civil rights groups who charged the 10 were political prisoners. Hunt went on statewide television last night to explain his decision.
From all that I have learned in reviewing this case, I have concluded that there was a fair trial. The jury made the right decision, and the appellate courts reviewed it properly and ruled correctly. I have confidence in what our courts and judges have done. Accordingly, I cannot and I will not pardon these defendants.
The bitterest reaction to Hunt's decision came from friends of Reverend Ben Chavez, who will not be eligible for parole until January 1980. Chavez's mother charged that Governor Hunt was unable to take a moral stand.
The Wilmington 10. Every time the president, any American, gets up in a world forum to speak of human rights in South Africa or the Soviet Union, the Russians and others point the finger right back and say, what about the Wilmington 10? Have those people received justice in the United States? It's a story that just won't go away. A year ago, we did a report about the Wilmington 10, 9 black men and a white woman who were sentenced to a total of 280 years in prison after arson and racial violence in Wilmington, North Carolina 7 years ago. Supporters of the Wilmington 10 continue to claim they're innocent, that they are in fact political prisoners. And just yesterday, the protests culminated in a march on the nation's capital. Yet another reminder to President Carter that human rights may be a two-edged sword.
I mean, it is kind of an international situation now because Brezhnev called in, as I understand, our ambassador, Malcolm Toon, at the Soviet embassy and said, what about this? How can you talk about our cases when you have this one?
Yeah, I've seen many cases go through the judicial system of our nation. And in almost every instance that I remember, the ultimate decision was a right one.
What appears to be the ultimate decision in the case of the Wilmington 10 has already been made by the governor of North Carolina. It's a highly controversial one, which we'll get to later. First, let's go back to the beginning. This is Gregory Congregational Church in Wilmington, North Carolina. It does not look like a setting for violence. But there was a time when Gregory Congregational was, for a few days, a battleground. February 1971. The National Guard mounts an assault on the church after 4 days of white and black terrorism. The Guard moved in, believing the church to be an armed fortress. What the Guard found was an empty building. 5 years later, 10 people went to prison for arson and conspiracy to assault police and firemen. 8 high school students, 29 and 31-year sentences. 1 white woman now free. And the supposed ringleader, Ben Chavez, now a minister, a sentence of 34 years. These are the Wilmington 10. Ben Chavez has been a civil rights activist since the age of 14. He admits to being militant, but denies ever having done anything illegal or violent.
We are totally innocent, categorically innocent of all those charges.
The man who prosecuted the Wilmington 10, Jay Stroud.
I think the evidence was overwhelming. Probably as overwhelming as any case I've ever prosecuted, and I've prosecuted a great number.
One thing both the prosecution and the Wilmington 10 agree on is that the trouble in Wilmington began in the city's high schools following court-ordered desegregation. Back in 1971, black students charged the schools with racism in class and on the sports field. And there was some violence in the schools.
A lot of black students.
Finally, the black students went on strike, a school boycott. The blacks gathered at Gregory Congregational Church to plan strategy, to articulate demands. The school problem began to divide the city along racial lines.
We're going to fight!
The whites gathered too, the Klan and a group calling itself the Rights of White People. They planned their strategy. It was in this atmosphere that Ben Chavis was asked to come to Wilmington by the pastor of Gregory Congregational, who felt the students needed leadership. Chavis had been working as a community organizer for a group called the Commission for Racial Justice and had been involved in similar situations before.
Within 24 hours of his presence in Wilmington, violent acts within the community outside of the school system started taking place. And as a result, that began about a 4 to 5 day period of incessant firebombings of businesses and sniping incidents.
My role was to try to mediate the situation. Now, I taught vocally, I made speeches, and I led marches, but it was all in a sense to try to resolve the conflict, not to broaden it, not to escalate it. Unfortunately, it became down to a whole racial kind of warfare situation.
It was war?
Yes, it was racial war that broke out.
You're suggesting that what started out as a fairly peaceful protest by a bunch of high school students became a reign of terror instigated by Ben Chavis.
Well, whether it was encouraged by him or others, I can't say, except that in the particular incident of Mike's Grocery, I can say that the evidence clearly showed that Mr. Chavis was the one who encouraged the Wilmington 10 to arm themselves with weapons and firebombs and directed them in the firebombing of Mike's Grocery Store. He instructed them that they should fire upon the firemen and the police officers, which they did.
Mike's was a white-owned store in a black neighborhood, and this is what remains of it today. Nothing. The irony of that night was that the fire spread from Mike's, and 2 houses lived in by blacks went up in smoke as well. Well, more than a year passed before the prosecution brought any charges against Chavis and the others. When they did, their case depended on the testimony of 3 key witnesses, all black, all teenagers, all with police records. Alan Hall was the prosecution's star witness. Later, he reversed his testimony. Whose idea was it to burn down Mike's grocery store?
It was my own idea. Ben wasn't in on it, and neither was any of the other defendants.
In addition to Hall, there were 2 other key witnesses who supported his original testimony. One was a young man who, at the time of the trial, was in custody for armed robbery in which there was a murder. He, too, says he committed perjury. And the other was a 13-year-old boy who now says he was bribed with the promise of a gift and a job if he would testify against Chavis and the others. But let's get back to the trial, in which the prosecution claimed that this church, Gregory Congregational Church, was the command post for an armed assault on white property, on police, and on firemen on the night of February 6, 1971. Well, there was one more witness in these parts that night, a witness who never appeared in court. He was the pastor of this church, the Reverend Eugene Templeton.
Let us worship God.
Reverend Templeton no longer lives in North Carolina. He's now acting pastor of a church in a small town in New Jersey. But back in 1971, as the white pastor of a black church, Gregory Congregational, Templeton was caught in the middle as violence broke out in Wilmington. With him was his wife, Donna.
There was a certain element of hysteria, beginning with the bomb threats.
What Donna and Gene Templeton describe is a church that was actually under siege by white extremists during that week in February 7 years ago.
We were trying to get a curfew at this point to keep this group from coming in. These are white men coming through in pickup trucks, basically on 7th Street, shooting toward the church. And Friday evening, there was just kind of a constant stream of these trucks coming through. 2 of the kids at the church were shot.
Now, during this period, fire wasn't just coming into the church, it was going out. It was being returned as well.
That's right. The blacks who were there were armed as well, and part of the thinking was to be able to put some of these trucks out of commission, or it was to try to stop this kind of onslaught that was coming. My role was to try to get in touch with as many people as possible to plead with the mayor and the police chief for a curfew, saying, we're really being shot at, we're really scared to death, we don't know what's going to happen, the police aren't stopping these trucks from coming in.
So we come into Saturday now.
Right.
Saturday night, February 6, 1971, the night the prosecution alleged that Chavis and the others firebombed Mike's Grocery. This is how the prosecution described the events that night in this church. A crowd of about 100 people were gathered here inside. Ben Chavis is making an announcement over a public address system, encouraging firebombing and shooting. Chavis is passing out guns. At about 9:30, according to the prosecution, Chavis announces they're going to firebomb Mike's Grocery. He leads a group out of a church. He goes down these stairs and through the alley between the church and the parsonage next door. Behind the church, according to the prosecution, Chavis hands out firebombs, and they go on to Mike's Grocery Store about a block away and set it on fire. Well, that's the prosecution's story. But according to the Templetons, the church was virtually empty that Saturday night. They say that they, Chavis, and a few others were here in the parsonage taking cover from incoming fire.
We felt as though we were just totally isolated, and if something didn't happen, these people were just going to come in and burn our neighborhood, probably kill us, and we were looking for some sort of lifeline to the outside.
About 9 o'clock was when Mike's Grocery caught on fire, and it was a huge fire. It was loud, it was bright, it was hot, and you could just hear the thing kind of almost, it was more like an explosion. And we went out back to see it.
Where was Ben before and during the fire?
He was in the house with us during that time.
During the whole time. That's what I'm saying is...
When Mike's Grocery burned, I can remember this distinctly, that Ben Chavis was standing in our kitchen, and I was there. I don't know if you were in the room or not. Probably were on the phone, and somebody ran in the back door and said, the grocery store is on fire. Can you come and help us move the furniture? And Ben had been in the house, and at that point was in the kitchen when Mike's Grocery Store was burning.
Later that night, a black teenager was shot and killed by a policeman near Mike's Grocery Store. The policeman claimed the young man had pulled a gun. And then the next morning, a white man was shot and killed near the church. It was alleged that he too was armed and that he was shooting at blacks. The two killings finally shocked the city into calling in the National Guard and finally imposing a curfew. And shortly afterwards, the Templetons moved away. At the time the Wilmington 10 were tried, the Templetons flew down to North Carolina to appear as defense witnesses. But before they reached Wilmington, they heard a rumor that they too would be arrested if they showed up. So they flew back home without testifying. But surely your testimony was critical. The two most, I guess, responsible people in that house that night were you and your wife.
That's right.
And could you have said, your hand on the Bible, Ben Chavis had nothing to do with that bombing, Ben Chavis had nothing to do with that shooting, Ben Chavis had nothing to do in instigating either of those things?
That I was prepared to say. But I wasn't sure that I'd even get the opportunity to get on the stand.
Personally, I'm very opposed to violence. I've never been involved in another violent situation, but in that particular situation, I felt as though my life was at stake, and that I really owed my life. My life depended on these black people who had these guns, who were protecting me from being shot by a white person.
Remember, the Templeton story was never heard by a jury, never told until that 60 Minutes broadcast a year ago. They did tell it to a judge last May at a hearing in North Carolina to determine whether the Wilmington 10 should be granted a new trial. The judge ruled against a new trial, stating that he wasn't concerned with matters of guilt or innocence, only whether the original trial was grossly unfair, and in his opinion, it was not. In Washington, we spoke about that original trial with the head of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, Drew Day.
We're not happy with that trial. As I think I indicated, we were troubled by many of the things that went on with respect to that trial and subsequent to that trial. But there's a difference between being troubled and having some constitutional or statutory jurisdiction to act.
Can we go through what troubles you?
Well, first and foremost, the three lead witnesses in the prosecution have subsequently recanted, and of course at the time that they testified, they admitted, at least two of them admitted, that they were accomplices in the circumstances surrounding the bombing of the grocery store, and it was not clear that they were acting with complete independence in giving the testimony that they did. There were indications of a somewhat unusual relationship between the prosecutor and these young witnesses. Evidence reflects the fact that the prosecutor provided one of the witnesses with a mini bike and a job. There were indications that the prosecutor, subsequent to the conviction of the Wilmington 10, provided money to at least two of the main witnesses. There were changes that appeared to be somewhat unusual in the sentences of the chief witnesses. So these circumstances, when looked at as a whole, raised serious questions about whether there was actually a fair process going on in Wilmington, North Carolina.
The Justice Department says its jurisdiction is limited. There is an appeal going through the federal courts, but that could take years. If you take this case through every legal stage that the federal government can take it through, and they're still locked up, and you feel that they're innocent, surely there could be a presidential pardon.
There cannot be. They are held by state authority, not by federal authority. And the presidential pardon does not reach to persons who are held by state officials.
One person who does have the authority to pardon offenders in North Carolina is the governor. And the problem of the Wilmington 10 landed in the lap of Governor James Hunt.
My fellow North Carolinians, I want to talk with you tonight about the Wilmington 10 case.
In late January, the governor announced his decision on statewide television. Among those listening was prosecutor Jay Stroud. Ben Chavis's family was also watching. His children, his sisters, his mother.
From all that I have learned in reviewing this case, I have concluded that there was a fair trial. The jury made the right decision, and the appellate courts reviewed it properly and ruled correctly.
The governor accepted the original verdict and refused to pardon the Wilmington 10. But he also said he felt the sentences were too severe and reduced most of them by about a third.
I will not pardon these defendants.
Jay Stroud was pleased with the governor's speech.
Particularly the closing part of his presentation about it's time to leave the bitterness and dissension and go on from here.
9 lives to Jim Hunt. 9 black lives mean nothing to him. Our only victory would have been that they would have gotten a pardon of innocence. They are perfectly innocent. The governor has lost a chance to prove himself morally worthy of the position which he holds as governor of the state of North Carolina.
So the story is still not over. From the original trial in 1972 through one court after another and one appeal after another, all the procedures of law have been observed. But many people feel that perhaps justice has not been truly served, that somewhere along the way, truth, or part of it, got lost. The governor of North Carolina has expressed little doubt about the truth. He believes the witnesses who later recanted told the truth at the original trial. And when asked about the Templeton story and the powerful alibi it provides for Ben Chavis, the governor replied that in his opinion, it was not worthy of belief.